Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at a hypermodern defense against the e4 opening, and that's the Alekhine defense, and it continues with knight to f6, development move for the knight, attacking the center, and what black hopes to do is allow white to gain the center control with his pawns, and at the same time he is not going to move his pawns toward the center. He's going to try to control the center with his minor pieces and undermine the situation that white has in the center. So we're going to look at the three main lines that you may see: the four-pawn attack, the exchange variation, and the modern attack, which is the main line, and talk about some of the key points that you'll want to know for each variation. The first line that we're going to take a look at is the four-pawn attack, and it's the most aggressive line that you'll see from white. And what it looks to do is control the entire center with its pawns while trying to chase the black knight all over the board. So it continues with pawn to e5, knight to d5, pawn to d4, and black responding with pawn to d6, trying to, one, give a little room for his light square bishop, and at the same time trying to undermine this pawn on e5 that's already in our camp here. And as you can see, this is going to be a common theme, this setup right here, and this is where all the lines are going to vary from this situation right here. And in this case, white's going to continue to put more pressure on our knight and continue to chase our knight around the board with pawn to c4. This is 3 pawns so far, and we're going to bring our knight to b6. And white's going to continue with pawn to f4. And this is the 4-pawn attack. And as you can already tell, this is the most aggressive because white already has 4 of his pawns in the middle of the board controlling the center. And we've only moved 1 pawn, and we've had our knight chased around the entire board the whole game, which, if you know anything about opening principles, you really don't want to move your minor pieces all around the board, but any hypermodern player will tell you that you want white, in this case, to overextend his pawns so that black can undermine and take control of the center later on in the game. But black really has to be careful not to play too passive, because white's going to run over him if he doesn't counterattack at some point in the game. So just something to think about if you are playing black, that yes, you play passive at the beginning, but then you don't play passive later on. You actually play very active later on. So something to think about. Now in this case, black has 2 different moves. He can capture with d takes on e5, or he also has a very sharp line of g5 right here, in hopes that white's going to capture on g5, and then after we exchange here on e5, and we trade off queens, white's going to be up material by 1 pawn, but as you can tell, the white king can no longer castle, and all 3 of these pawns in the center are going to be really hard for white to defend, and they're going to be very easy for black to attack. Black can bring his bishop into the action, and once he brings his knight into the action, his b knight, he can castle queenside, and he's going to have a lot of attacking lines, and white's going to have a really hard game holding onto all these pawns and protecting his king out in the middle. So this is the sharp line that you may see. And as we talked about, another move is pawn takes on e5. And from here, after pawn takes on e5, then we can bring our knight to c6, attacking both this pawn on e5 and d4. Great development move for black, trying to control the center. From here, you may see white bring his bishop to e3, trying to hold on to this d4 pawn. This is going to be a huge attack. As you can already tell, we had 2 attackers on it, this knight and our queen here. And now we're going to bring our bishop into the action with bishop to f5. And in this case, we're really looking to bring our queen maybe to d7 and castle queenside and really try to put a lot of pressure on this d4 pawn. So this is the 4-knight attack. It is, again, the most aggressive that you'll see from white, but you may not see it as often as the other 2 lines. So we're going to take a look at those as well. The next line we're going to take a look at is the exchange variation. It's very common if you ever do play the Alekhine defense. You'll see it quite often. And it continues much like the 4-pawn attack, with pawn to e5 attacking our knight, knight to d5, pawn to d4, pawn to d6. Remember, we said we're going to see this setup many times before. White's going to continue with the 3-pawn setup with pawn to c4. And after our knight comes to b6, white's now going to exchange on d6. Now, if you're a very defensive player, you're not very aggressive, and you like sharp tactical lines, later on in the game and you like to build up in the center, then I would recommend pawn takes on d6. And from here, black's going to look to put his light square bishop on e6, and bring his dark square bishop to e7, castle kingside. He's going to have a very sharp and methodically defensive game. Now, if you're a very aggressive player like myself and you want to avoid the common sharp line that you'll see many times from capturing with your e-pawn, you can instead capture with your c-pawn with c takes on d6. Now from here, keep in mind that since we have our pawns on e7 and d6, we're going to fianchetto our bishop on the king side. And this is something you always want to think in the back of your head. If we have our pawns on e7 and d6 and we've already made a few moves in the opening, we're going to move our bishop to g7, because it's going to take 2 moves for our pawns to get out of the way of our bishop. So keep that in mind. And again, we're going to try to attack this d4 pawn, and that's another reason we want to bring our bishop to the g7 square. This d4 pawn is a very strong pawn from white, and we want to put as much pressure on that as possible. So from here you may see play continue with knight to c3. Great development move for white, putting a lot of pressure on the center. And from here, as we talked about before, we're going to bring our pawn to g6. And then you may see white bring his bishop to e3, putting another defender on this d4 pawn. Now keep in mind, you might not see white play this way, so if he's not too familiar with capturing the exchange variation with our c pawn, and he doesn't put a lot of defense on this d4 pawn, it's going to be very good for you. Once we bring our bishop to g7, we're going to be putting a lot of pressure on this d4 pawn. So if he's not building up his defenses, if he's instead playing, his bishop out and then trying to castle kingside, you may be able to take this d4 pawn a little easier than you may have expected. So from here you may see the white rook come to c1, and from here we're going to castle kingside. You always want to castle kingside sooner than later. Make sure your king's in a safe place. From here you may see white bring his pawn to b3, trying to put another defender on this c4 pawn. Remember, we are attacking it with our knight here. Anytime we can bring our queen into the action with a move like queen to c7. So from here, we're just going to bust through the middle. Again, we're trying to attack this d4 pawn, but at the same time, like we talked about it before, you don't want to be too passive if you're black in the Alekhine defense. We've allowed white to have a lot of tempo gaining attacks early on, chasing our knight around. So eventually, depending on where white plays, if he plays defensive correctly, then we want to bust up the middle, and we want to make sure that he doesn't have all the central control that he wants to with all his pawns. So these are some of the things you'll want to take a look at in the exchange variation. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the main line. And the main line from the beginning starts out the same as the other 2 lines. White comes to e5, our knight's going to come to d5, white's going to play pawn to d4, and we're going to bring our pawn to d6. But from here it's going to be a little bit different. White's going to bring his knight to f3. And this is the modern variation, and it's the main line, so you'll see it more often than not. Now from here, this white knight is very, very active. He's gaining central control, but at the same time, he's attacking and defending both the pawn on e5 and this pawn on d4. So this is a very strong knight right here. And this is why many times you'll see black bring his bishop to g4, pinning down this queen. His knight's not going to move. And many times from here, depending on where white plays, black's going to trade off this bishop. A lot of times you'll see players try not to trade off their bishop for knight early on, since a bishop pair is usually stronger, since it's easier to open up a game than it is to close up a game. But a lot of times a black player in this position will trade off his bishop because that knight on f3 is so strong. So I usually don't recommend trading off your bishop if you are pinning it down. I like to just pin down that knight. But in the Alekhine defense, I actually recommend to trade off your bishop for that knight on f3 since it is so powerful. So this is one thing you may see, and from here white's just going to take back with his bishop on f3. So that's one variation that you may see. You want to trade off that knight. And another one you may see, instead of g4, you may just see pawn to g6. A lot of players instead like to try to bust up the middle. They already have one attacker with their d6 pawn, and from here they just try to start to chip away at the center. So they're going to look to fianchetto their bishop to the g7 square, castle kingside, and then they're going to look to try to attack the center control here. So you can, again, a lot of players from here, even if they do fianchetto with their bishop on the king side, then they may bring their bishop out to attack this knight on f3. So it really depends on which way you want to go, but these are some of the most common lines that you will see in the main line. So hope you guys enjoyed the video on the Alekhine defense. If you haven't already, please subscribe. If you haven't checked out the website, got a lot of great updates on it. It's www.thechesswebsite.com. Please leave me any comments. Let me know how the videos are going, and I'll see you guys next video. Thanks for watching.